Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we have Dr. Josh Rasmussen. Actually, I don't even think I put the view and gallery view. There we go. Now people can see you. You exist.
Now I really exist.
Exactly.
Now that you can see me.
You need to be perceived to exist, of
That's
course.
it.
Man, I started off my channel with a joke. Did you hear that George Barkley died? Yeah, his girlfriend stopped seeing him.
Oh yeah.
It was
That's
atrocious.
like Alvin Flanagan. He said that he knew a solipsist once, and he said that he was getting older in age, and he was talking with him about how when you go, the rest of us are going to go, so we got to keep you alive.
Exactly. Okay. Well, in addition to my ghostly appearance, because there's like a big light right there, we're going to be talking today about omniscience and Platonism as well, basically just Russellian paradoxes and what we can learn from them with respect to the fundamental nature of reality, in particular Platonism, but also omniscience, and in particular one's model of God. So how could Russellian paradoxes particularly influence one's model of God? Maybe you can't hold certain views of God if you take Russellian paradoxes seriously. And we'll see as this conversation develops, different ways to respond to that and so on. So yeah, Josh, thanks for coming on. And do you have anything preliminary before I start sharing the slides or?
Thank you. Yeah, nothing really, except I didn't know if we wanted to maybe start with Russell's quote. You mentioned Russellian paradoxes. Bertrand Russell himself didn't have a solution to this paradox. People know of Russell's set paradox, but there's this other, I think it's a more foundational paradox that is sort of like this seed for lots of potential wisdom. And so Russell, he talks about this. He talks about it in I think it's Principles of Mathematics, Appendix B. And I just have to say, Joe, in graduate school, I was thinking about propositions, and I came to this same paradox independently. And I was really wondering about it. I remember talking with Peter Van Wagen about it and kind of working through some different solutions. And then some of my friends pointed me to Russell's paradox, and basically it's the same problem. So do you actually have the slide with the quote? We could look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me click share the screen. I'm not sure if they'll be able to see our faces while I do this, but we're just gonna try. So there, you should, can you see it here?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. So he says, what the complete solution of the difficulty, and we're going to be talking about what this difficulty is, what that may be, I have not succeeded in discovering it. Okay, so there he's displaying his intellectual humility, or I don't know. I mean, he works hard to solve all these other paradoxes, even like with respect to sets and stuff. And then he comes to this one and he doesn't solve it. So he says, as it affects the very foundations of reasoning, I earnestly commend the study of it to the attention of all students of logic. And I think really just like anybody who wants to build their worldview can get wisdom, I think, out of just studying the problem and thinking about possible solutions.
Yeah. So I know I'm gonna turn it over to you to talk about what's at stake, because you're talking about the fundamental nature of reality. But also, I just want to give the audience, we've been talking about Russell's paradox and so on. So a basic way to think about Russell's paradox is, of course, the barber paradox, right? So suppose that there is a barber of whom the following is true, right? The barber in this particular town shaves all and only those people who don't shave themselves. Okay, so if someone doesn't shave themselves, well, then the barber's going to shave them. Maybe it's the only barber in town. They're going to go see this barber or whatever. And also the barber only shaves people who don't shave themselves. So he's not going to give any business to people who shave themselves. So it's like someone shaves himself, he's like, nope, you're not among my candidates that I'm going to shave. Now, of course, we can ask about this very barber. Does he shave himself? I mean, I could have gone gender neutral. Maybe does she? I mean, maybe we don't have to worry about that. Does the barber shave himself? Well, if he does shave himself, well, remember, he only shaves people who don't shave themselves. So in that case, if he shaves himself, he doesn't shave himself. That's absurd. Okay, so now suppose that he doesn't shave himself. But remember, he shaves all those people in the town that don't shave themselves, right? And so he's going to have to shave himself. So if he doesn't shave himself, he does shave himself. So what we get is that he shaves himself if and only if he doesn't shave himself. And that gives us a contradiction. So that's kind of a basic way to think about it. I hope that was clear to the audience. It's a little bit difficult to wrap your mind around it, but it's basically like if you have a set and we're thinking about the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, or the set of all sets that don't have themselves as members, you could just ask of that set, is it a member of itself? And you're going to be able to say both yes and no. So yeah, is that a
Yeah, I love that.
it?
Yeah, so you're pointing to this problem of self-reference, and I really do think it's the self-reference that is the seed that gives rise to a host of different related paradoxes. And I wanted to note just at some point that there are different ways of having self-reference. I had a conversation with Alex Malpaz a few years ago about this topic, and in that conversation, it was helpful because even in the conversation, I was realizing that we can distinguish between a kind of like rigid or direct self-reference, where if you have something that points directly to itself, versus a kind of non-rigid self-reference where I guess it'd be good to have an example if I say something like, whatever sentence I point to in the next 5 seconds is a sentence.
Yeah.
And then it happens to be that I point to that very sentence in the next 5 seconds. That's not like a direct self-reference because the sentence wasn't directly referring to itself. It was kind of, in a way, describing a scenario that then later the description applied to itself. So it's kind of indirect self-reference. And what I actually think is that the direct self-reference is what gives rise to the sort of deepest, most important problems. And it's the direct self-reference that's going to lead to this paradox of omniscience and Platonism that we'll talk about here in a moment. Okay. So it really is, I think, the self-reference that is the seed from which the problems sprout.
Okay. So
what's at stake? Everything.
Yeah, everything is at stake. So
by the way, I gave this talk at a philosophy conference for professional philosophers. It was a philosophy colloquium. And so I wanted to kind of make it fun. I started with this question, what's at stake? And, with the PowerPoint, it doesn't show the answer right away. So like everybody's in the room. Okay, what's at stake? Everything is at stake.
Yeah,
exactly. Because it has to do with the foundation of reality. I mean, it's like if there are ways of describing the foundation so that you get to these contradictions. And then there are ways of resolving that actually has implications about the fundamental nature of reality. At the end of this presentation, I talk about a way of characterizing fundamental reality to overcome the paradox. So yeah, there's a lot at stake here. Everything.
Yeah. So the roadmap.
Yeah. So what I think would be good here is, because I want to talk with you not just about Platonism, but also a problem with omniscience, is if you could skip to the packaging problem, just get right to the paradox.
Yeah, so the general problem that you sent me in an email just now was this, and then after this, you give the kind of propositional setup. So
yeah, okay, yeah, good.
If you want to, which one do you want to tackle first?
Yeah, I want to just describe this general problem because I think this is kind of a bird's eye view of what you could call the general problem of packages. Okay, so we just talked about the problem of pointing, self-pointing, pointing to itself or self-reference, and you actually get this problem of self-reference if you have a view of things being packaged by other things. Okay, so I'm going to just read this packaging assumption, and then I'm going to illustrate it a little bit, and then I'm going to show how it leads to a contradiction. So the packaging assumption, this is the general assumption, is that for any things that there are, any real things, whatever they are, whether they're numbers, people, particles, anything, whatever they are, call them the X's, there's some package of just them. For example, you might think there's a set of just them. So that the set would, in a way, be a package of those things. So if you have 10 marbles, in addition to the 10 marbles, there's also the set of those 10 marbles, right? So mathematicians like to talk about sets of things. And you might sort of want to say that like all things, whatever they are, have a set, but then there's famous problems with that. The problem actually we're talking about here. Another example of a package is going to be like a proposition. So, there's the proposition that those things exist, or you can have a thought about them, or, and this is relevant to omniscience, if there's knowledge of them. So for any things that exist, there's knowledge of those things, then that knowledge in a way is a way of packaging those things. So the knowledge of the marbles is in itself a marble. It's something else that packages the marbles. I'm using the term package in a very general way. I just mean anything that refers to those other things and sort of binds them together by reference. So that's the starting assumption. You might feel like initially that shouldn't be a problem, but that assumption leads straight to a contradiction through sort of a famous line of Russellian argumentation. So I'll just complete the argument then. Premise 2 is, if premise 1, if that assumption is true, then there's going to be a package, call it P for paradox, of the things that aren't in their own package. So just to back up a little bit here, some packages will be in their own package if premise 1 is true, and some will not. So for example, consider the package of all things. That package is among the real things. And so therefore that package, the package of all things, is itself in its own package. So it's self-referenced. All right. But not all packages are going to be in themselves, like the package of all the blue things. That package is not itself blue. Okay. The package of all the marbles, that's not itself marble. So let P be the package of all the things that aren't in their own package. P exists according to the first premise. There is a package for all things, including all things not in their own package. But then this third premise is the contradiction, which is that if you think about it, P is going to be in its own package if and only if it isn't in its own package. And it takes a little bit of work to tease this out. The way that I do it is, first I imagine, well, let's assume P is in its own package. What does that imply? Then let's assume that P is not in its own package. What does that imply? And we can show that in both ways, we get a contradiction. Would you like me to kind of draw that out a little bit, or?
Yeah, I would, because some of our listeners, aren't going to be professional philosophers. So I do want them to be able to see this contradiction, like to see it for themselves. Both you and I really appreciate that. Like, don't just take our word for this, right? See it with your own light of reason.
I love that, Joe, that you love that. This is my number one rule in my classes. I always tell them my number one rule for this class is don't believe me just because I tell you.
Exactly.
I invite you to see it for yourself. Yeah, I think that really does make you very powerful if you can see it for yourself. So, so you can help clarify this, but I'm going to just sort of describe those two parts of the contradiction. So let's assume first that P, which is the package, and maybe for concreteness, let's just imagine the package is knowledge, because we're going to be talking about knowledge. So let's say it's God's knowledge of the things that aren't within that very package. So this won't be God's knowledge of everything, because obviously God's knowledge of everything is in itself, but this is the knowledge of all the things that are not in themselves. And so then let's imagine that this item of knowledge, P, is actually in itself. Let's imagine that that's the case. Well, if it's in itself, then by definition, it's actually the package of all the things that aren't in themselves. So by its own definition, it can't actually be in itself. So if it's in itself, then it's not in itself. So you get a contradiction that way. So then you think, well, then therefore you must say that it's not in itself. That must be what you say. But if you say it's not in itself, then the problem is that this very package P packages all of the things that aren't in itself. So if P is itself one of the things that's not in itself, then P, are you following me? P has to be one of the things it's packaging, because it's by definition packaging all the things that aren't in itself. So if we say it's not in itself, then it is one of the things that's packaging. But if it's one of the things it's packaging, that means it's packaging itself. So if it's not in itself, then it is in itself, and that's a contradiction in that direction. Okay, help me make that clear. I mean, I don't know. It's a very technical deduction. I don't know if you can say that in a clearer way or in a better way.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I think that was as clear as it's going to get. I mean, I can try, right? So saying things different ways can sometimes help people, right? So we have this package, right? Remember, for the audience, P is a package. It exists, and it is a package of all and only those things that aren't in their own package, okay? So that's what P is. There's a package P of the things that aren't in their own package. Now, either P is in its own package or it's not. Okay, that's just either P or not. Like for some proposition Q, either Q or not Q, right? Law of excluded middle, essentially. Now, so P is either in itself, which by which I mean that it's in its own package, or it's not. Now, if it's in itself, well, remember, this package only contains things that aren't in themselves, right? It only contains things that aren't in their own package. And so if it's in itself, then it's not in itself. Okay,
Joe, here's our package. This is the visual aid, if people can see it. This is P. And we're imagining that it includes itself somehow. All right, keep going.
Yeah.
This will help people's minds.
Exactly. If it's in itself, well, then remember, because it only contains things that aren't in themselves, it follows that it's not in itself. So if it's in itself, then it's not in itself. So that's absurd. So we went down that horn, right? We suppose that it's in itself. But now let's go down the other horn, right? It's not in itself. Now, but if it's not in itself, remember, this package includes everything that's not in themselves, right? It includes all and only those things that aren't in themselves. And so if it's not in itself, it meets that condition, in which case it belongs in itself, right? And so if it's not in itself, then it is, in which case we get a contradiction. So either way, whether we suppose that it's in itself or we suppose that it's not in itself, we get a contradiction. And so contradiction ensues either way. That's why it's contradictory. Anyway, I hope that people are seeing this because it's fun, firstly. But secondly, it is like, don't feel bad if you're kind of struggling to get it on the first try, or maybe you're still struggling, because it is kind of technical and abstract. So, but I hope that we've gotten people along.
Yeah, that's good. And I want to just say personally, this argument, it was a bug in my own mind. This argument's not one of those arguments that I sort of liked the conclusion and thought, how can I make a path to this conclusion I like? No. I rejected the conclusion, okay? And this bug just entered my mind. And I was like, get out of here. But I'm like, how do I get the bug out? And I thought of different ideas, different proposals. But in the end, for me, I couldn't find, it seems like the best way to get the bug out is actually to just accept the conclusion, to deny the starting assumption. And so we'll talk about some possible proposals. And I don't want to say any of this too forcefully, because I do think that this argument is kind of a seed for thinking about many different possibilities. But I think it is helpful just to kind of share my own journey and kind of talk about some of the possibilities that I've considered and why, in the end, I don't think those possibilities are the best solution. And then in the end, how this has updated my own thinking, updated my worldview about the nature of fundamental reality, the nature of abstract objects, the nature of God's mind. This is why like everything's at stake, right? Because to solve the problem, you kind of have to think about everything. So yeah, it is fun, but it's also very interesting.
All right. To think about everything, then you'd be thinking about that very own thought, and then we can consider all those thoughts that aren't about themselves, and then everything explodes. Okay.
You can't think about everything.
Yeah, exactly.
That leads to the self-reference problem.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Because that very thought would be something. Okay. So we have this closer look. Do you want to? I mean, right after this is Russell's response, but do you want to go through the closer look?
I think maybe not, because the closer look is just a way of unpacking those premises. Oh yeah, I love this. The biggest question in philosophy. How can things exist such that it is not true that those things exist? Joe, when I saw this slide again, I forgot like what I was thinking. So I just saw the question and I was like, how can things exist such that it's not true that those things exist? Why would somebody ask that? And then I remembered, oh yeah, that's the conclusion of the paradox. The conclusion of the paradox is that there are things that exist such that there's no package of those things. Now, if it's true that they exist, then it's being true that they exist would be the package of those things. And so actually the conclusion of the paradox is that there are things such that it's not true that there are those things. So then I say, this is the biggest question of philosophy. How can that be? How can there be things such that it's not even true that there are those things? Right? So there you go. That's the question for everybody to think about and see where it leads them.
Yeah, I mean, right immediately here, I mean, I'm kind of reminded about my discussion that I had. The thumbnail I'm proud of. It says, by the way, 1 + 1 = 2 is false. It's one I had with Dr. Kenny Boyce. He is a fictionalist novelist. Now, presumably, I mean, I'm thinking about the way he would respond to this question. Well, he would say, well, it's true that they exist. It's just that there is no truth that is about them, or, like there isn't that existence assumption of the thing that's packaging them, as it were. There is no such package. So we can still say that it's true without there being the truth, as it were. Is that a way out?
Well, I don't think it is. But it's interesting that you mentioned the fictionalism, because the fictionalist also falls prey to the same paradox if they say that it's false that 2 + 2 = 4, because in a way, even the falsehood provides a package. Now, I think that the way out that you're pointing to is a way out of positing abstracta.
Yeah.
But you don't even need to think of this as abstracta. You can think of it in terms of concrete sentences. The problem arises from the pointing, the self-reference.
Yeah.
So even if you have sentences that are concrete on a piece of paper, as long as those sentences are referring to things other than themselves, well, it could even refer to itself. That's where you get the self-reference. But then the sentence is acting as the package.
And the same thing would be true of thoughts, right? So
yeah. So I guess for the mathematical fictionalist, I'd want to say, how can things exist such that it's not false that those things exist, right? For the fictionalist, right? Because the falsehood also creates a package. Mm-hmm. So the conclusion is actually that there are some things such that it's not true that they exist, and it's not even false that they exist either.
Oh my goodness!
No package.
Yeah, dude. I mean? Okay, I haven't. Okay, I haven't even looked. Okay, I'm just stepping back. I didn't even. I promise you, I was not looking at I have not seen this thing before you said. Yeah, this is the first solution that you went through. So,
well, this is a different version of fictionalism.
Okay.
So this is the not the mathematical fictionalism, but the sort of fictionalist with respect to the existence of truths. And here I just want to make a very sharp, is that the right word? A clean distinction that is often blurry in people's minds, which is the difference between the truth bearer and the truth maker. And so some people say, and I was thinking about this, reflecting on my conversation with Alex Malpaz about the nature of truths and truth makers. And I think sometimes people will raise objections to truth making. So snow is white makes the proposition that snow is white true. And they'll say, well, maybe the proposition that snow is white is true. Maybe that could be true, not because there's some other thing that makes it true, but just because the proposition that snow is white just describes a reality, but the reality is not making it true. But here's the point: is even if there's not a truth maker, there's still the truth bearer. There's still the proposition or the sentence or whatever you want to call it, the thing that is true. So this fictionalist solution here on the screen is not saying it's not just saying that there are no truth makers. It's saying that there aren't even truth bearers. There's nothing, whether a thought, a sentence, a proposition, that is true.
That's what I was trying to. Yeah. So I didn't express myself well, but back here when I'm saying it's not true,
oh, okay.
I was thinking that what you were assuming is for it to be true that those things exist.
But there
must be the truth, right?
Yeah.
I was just bringing in the mathematical fictional just because it relates to that, and a lot of the moves that Kenny Boyce makes in there would be made here. But anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for clarifying that. So you really were anticipating. So I feel like sometimes I think, Joe, that you and our minds are like quantumly entangled. Our beings are unified, and then we have a lot of similar thoughts. So yes, you anticipated the very first proposal, which is...
That's why I was like so excited. I was like, oh my goodness, like, whoa, that's kind of creepy.
It's the same thing. So what do I say? What's my response to that? Do I give a response? Oh, I say fictionalism is not true, right? I'm trying to be kind of cute in a way. Right, like, I mean, are you going to say fictionalism, it's not even true, right? Well, then, what are you saying? I think kind of a more sophisticated response is just to point to our usage of language that is hard to analyze or accommodate apart from there being some kind of true things. Like, so for example, I might say, well, some of the things that Joe thinks are true. And I might not even specify which of those things they are, just like he has at least some true beliefs, and that's enough for there to be some true things.
Yeah, I mean,
because I'm not. Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like I have direct access. I don't know. I can just like see in my own mind that I have certain thoughts and beliefs and so on. And like,
Yes.
I don't know. I think that I'm just like directly aware that they can like be true or false. And so there are things, namely, I don't know, maybe thoughts, beliefs, and so on. And those things can be true or false, or at least if we're Platonists, we might say derivatively true, a derivative
Sure,
upon a
sure.
proposition.
Yeah.
But whatever, like I seem
You
to have
can leave
direct
that
access to
open.
that. Yeah.
Yes, I'm right exactly with you there. Like, so for example, right now I'm thinking about a blue ball. Okay, I'm not lying. Um, and in that moment that, I close my mind just to verify this for myself. I close my mind. I close my eyes. My mind is still open. So I have this proposition in my mind, or this thought, whatever you want to say, that there's a blue ball, that I'm thinking of a blue ball. And then I notice the thought of the blue ball. And then I compare the thought that I'm thinking about a blue ball with a thought of a blue ball. And I see that there's a match there. The thought is describing, it's like I've got one thought describing another one. Probably better if I use like an image of a blue ball, one thought describes the other. And then through this kind of direct access, I can see truth right in my own mind. So yeah, so this doesn't seem to me to be the most promising solution. I would say maybe as a last resort, if all else fails and you don't want all of reality to explode into nothing, we can come back here.
All right. So on to solution 2, are you good with that?
So here, just for our purposes, I even want to leave open how to think of propositions. So in this particular talk, I was describing why I thought that there is a problem with abstract, ungrounded propositions. But here I want to just say that even if propositions are concrete, you can still generate the paradox.
You just need the reference, right?
Yeah, you just need the reference problem.
Okay.
So, I mean, I do sort of play with concretism, and I say, well, concretism is not self-concrete, but let's just leave that open for sake of argument.
Okay,
Yeah.
So then, and conceptualism presumably, I mean, again, you can level independent problems to it, but again, we still have the reference, right?
Yes, that's it. Yeah, and here there's different versions of conceptualism. I just focused on the concepts being anchored to your own mind. So all propositions like depend on your own mind. You could generalize this and say maybe all propositions depend on some mind. And actually, I've become increasingly sympathetic with this. We can talk about that maybe at the end. But yeah, so even if we analyze propositions in terms of concepts, you still get concepts pointing to themselves, so you still get the same problem. So we can even just kind of leave this open.
Okay, and presumably the same thing would apply to divine conceptualism.
Absolutely,
it doesn't by itself solve the problem.
Yeah, and so in this particular talk, the audience was a diverse audience, and I was making no sort of assumptions here, and I wanted to show, yes, exactly, that the paradox persists on a wide variety of different models.
Yeah, and I actually kind of like this on the screen, right? This is just showing how you can generate the same kind of mere divine conceptualism is not going to help, because you could just specify T, which is the divine thought, or the divine thoughts, or T is the thought about all and only those divine thoughts that aren't about themselves. And so that itself is going to be divine thought, and you're going to have to get the contradiction again that it's about itself if and only if it's not. So
yeah,
this is just a concrete way of showing how merely appealing to divine conceptualism isn't going to help get around this Russellian paradoxical worry.
Yes. Yeah.
And
yes,
that's again,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say for the audience, this is all playing up to our discussion of omniscience, because that's ultimately one of the ways, or Josh is going to argue that for those who think that God exists and is omniscient and so on, arguably you're going to have to take a stance on a particular way that God is omniscient, or a particular view about God's omniscience in order to avoid this problem. And so merely having, let's say, divine conceptualism won't help. You're going to have to go further and get some more robust, substantive theses that people might not have fully appreciated, or people actually might not agree with antecedently. So
myself among those people. I mean, it did end up changing my mind, but if you could actually go up to the problem of packages, I think that's a good way of bringing us to the problem of omniscience. Just the general problem.
Is that the general problem?
Yeah, that right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to now focus this problem on the problem of omniscience.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to talk about what I think is like the best kind of response that ultimately doesn't convince me. And then I'll provide my own model, kind of where I'm at currently.
All right.
And
So
I'm still
yeah,
thinking about this.
just a quick note. Right after you finish kind of outlining the problem with respect to omniscience, I'm going to make both of us full screen again so they can. I don't even know if the recording is going to show them our faces while the screen is sharing. So we can at least be certain that they can see our glorious faces. Of course.
Well, I hope they can see us even now. But if they can't, that will be a great evil.
Yes, exactly. And that would be atrocious, especially because you're doing the in and out things with your.
I would stop believing in God. That's the kind of evil that there could be no good reason for that.
Exactly. So. Totally gratuitous.
Okay. So here we have the seed that gives rise. Number one is the seed that gives rise to the packaging problem. So I'm going to just read it again. For any things, whatever they are, call them the X's. There's something that packages them, whether it's a set, a proposition, a thought, or knowledge. Okay, knowledge is going to be the key here. And by the way, sometimes people will ask me about sets. They say, well, don't we have a solution to this problem? Isn't this why we have Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which in a way provides a restriction on the kinds of things that can be packaged by sets? And, doesn't that solve the problem? And can't we do the same thing with respect to propositions and with respect to knowledge? And we can come back to how we might try to apply a restriction. I think that's an important kind of question. Like, is there a way of applying a restriction? But actually, what I want to say is that what the problem does is it actually tells us that we need some restriction. And the Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory is, in a way, kind of shining the light on this result. It's in a way accepting the conclusion of this argument. It's saying that, yes, like not everything is packaged. The necessary truth at the end, necessarily not everything is packaged, whether by a set or by an item of knowledge. So we do need to have some kind of restriction. And it's also kind of interesting too, when you think about set theory, that Zermelo-Fraenkel's solution has always kind of bothered me. I came up with my own set of axioms because I never really thought that all of their axioms were true. Just to be very honest, like when I try to see it for myself, I'm not just following the authorities and the mathematician. When I was at Notre Dame, I got into these arguments with a math professor who liked set theory. And I said, I'm not against sets. I just don't think the Zermelo-Fraenkel got the first principles right. And part of the problem is it just seems sort of arbitrary. Like why do sets package some things and not other things? It's like if sets are going to package things, they should just package everything. So I kind of sort of like the plural reference view that sets aren't actually packages. They're just ways of referring plurally to things, and that provides kind of a clean solution. There's another idea in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There's this thing you can find called positive set theory, which I'm not going to go into that, but I thought that felt a little bit less arbitrary than Zermelo-Fraenkel's theory. But either way, no matter how you respond to this, whether you follow Zermelo and Fraenkel's solution or something else, you're still going to be accepting this result, that there's a necessary truth such that not everything is packaged. So how does this relate to omniscience? Well, I think you can sort of anticipate this here, because knowledge acts as a package. If God knows all things that exist, God knows that Joe and I exist, and God knows that Joe, I, and the audience exists. And so, there's God knows everything that exists. So then for any things, the X's, there's some knowledge of those X's. And that contradicts, obviously, the conclusion of this argument. So what are you going to do? How are you going to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, just for the audience, notice what we just concluded. Not everything is known. Not everything. God doesn't know everything. God couldn't know everything. Yes. I'm just going to reiterate just to reiterate that is significant.
Yes.
God doesn't know everything and cannot know everything. Let that sink in. Okay, because that's significant.
So I have an article. Do you remember the name of my article, Joe? It came out in this book. It's a little chapter. I sent you like a draft. It's on this topic where I describe.
I'm gonna link that in the description. Would you let me link that in the description?
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So everyone check out the first link in the description under the all caps resources. It's very accessible. It's very accessible, and
it's for a general audience.
It's for a general audience, and it's about this paradox of omniscience and Josh's solution to it, and how it affects your model of God, which we're going to talk about soon. So yeah. Anyway, go on.
Well, yeah, and I also share my story there because when I was at Notre Dame, there was just this random day where I was outside, and for whatever reason, I was thinking about infinities. I was thinking about mathematics and numbers, and I was just like thinking about God knowing all of the numbers, and that didn't seem so problematic. But it's like after you know all of the numbers, then there's this other thing that you know, which is your knowledge of all the numbers. And then your knowledge of all the numbers. And that leads to like this other infinite step. And then once that's like completed in some weird way of completing the infinite set, there's like also God's knowledge of his knowledge of that. And it just like, there was something about it that just, it made my mind go weird. And just, I don't know, like sometimes I'll kind of send out a thought into the universe, just into the cosmic mind, or, however you want to put this. It's like, I was like, God, do you just see all of that? Like these, and I had this thought back, and this could be, just out of my own psychology, right? There's several ways of interpreting it, but the thought back was, I leave some things open for discovery. And I thought, well, I can't believe that. I don't believe that. I was a Platonist. I thought all the abstract, even God's mind aside, there are all these abstract things are already there. But then after that episode, that's when I began to discover this propositions paradox. And when I started teaching at APU, I would sometimes bring this up in some of my more advanced classes, and we'd have some discussions, and sometimes I'd talk with other philosophers about it. And a few years back, I gave this talk talking about it, going through some solutions. And it's one of those problems, like sometimes a problem kind of goes away after you think about it. You get some more clarity, it goes away. But other times a problem gets bigger as you think about it. I've been thinking about this with respect to materialism and thinking about reality being fundamentally mindless. It's like sometimes a problem, like once you think about it more carefully, you can sort of resolve the problems. And sometimes they sort of sprout into more and more problems. And that happened with respect to this problem. Like the more that I thought about it, the sharper the problem came, the clearer the contradiction seemed to be. And so in my little article, I kind of say it's like the twin witnesses of revelation and reason began to change my mind about sort of the foundations of math, the foundations of logic, and the foundations of a supreme mind as well. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, so we've laid out the paradox, right? The paradox, just to the audience, is about packaging, and knowledge is one such kind of package. It's referring to things. And what we conclude is that not everything can be packaged. So not everything can be known by God. God doesn't know everything, and cannot know everything, because such would entail a contradiction. Now that's significant. So we're going to start going into, if you're cool with it, some ways that people respond to this. So I know you mentioned a kind of a pretty popular response, about the divisibility of God's mind. So do you want to go through that?
Yeah. So I want to say, if the argument is sound, you get that conclusion. And I don't want to overstate, my own kind of current thinking about this, because I really do think that Bertrand Russell is right. Like this is a problem that invites all students of logic to think about, or just students of worldview to think about. And I think wisdom can sort of flow out of your own thinking about this problem. And so you might have a solution that makes more sense to your mind than the solution that I arrive at. But yeah, what I want to do next is just talk about what I think is perhaps the most promising type of solution that isn't the one that I land on. And it's also, I think, the most common one that I've received, other than the ones that we've already talked about. So that's the idea that if you actually can just put the argument back on the screen, that argument assumes that God's mind if we're applying the argument now to omniscience, is sort of divisible into packages. So
there we go.
Right. So assume that for any things that there's a package of just them. And I say, for example, knowledge of just them. So there could be like this package of God's knowing that you exist, and then another package of God's knowing that I exist. Those are two different packages in God's own mind. Now, there are different views about God's mind. Some people have held that view. I mean, this was kind of a view that I had because, I was a Platonist. So I already thought that fundamental reality was divisible into infinitely many distinct packages of numbers and propositions. And I remember having conversations with my wife, Rachel. She had the incredulous stare. She's like, Josh, are you saying like all these books, all the propositions these books are expressing, all the stories already exist out there? I'm like, yeah, of course.
Obviously.
And she's just like, no, there's something wrong about that. And, I didn't believe her until logic sort of forced me to.
Yeah.
There's something at least problematic.
Yeah.
Okay, so there may be different ways of responding, but one way of responding in terms of omniscience is to say, what actually a classical view of God's mind is that it's simple, and that God knows things not by dividing them into packages of concepts or into packages of thoughts or anything like that in the way that we would. He just knows them directly in a kind of simple, singular act of awareness. He just sees all. That's the idea. And if you say that, then you can deny that first premise, but you can also keep omniscience. So in other words, you accept the conclusion of the argument, because the first premise is what leads to the conclusion, that the starting assumption is false. But then you just incorporate divine omniscience by understanding it in terms not of packages, but of a single act of awareness. Does that make sense? Did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. So what they're doing is, they're granting, they're not disputing this deduction from the all and only non-self-referencing. They're not disputing that. Instead, they're just saying, well, this assumes that we're dividing up God's knowledge into little bits and pieces and so on, each corresponding to a particular, let's say, proposition or whatever. But they're going to say, no, I deny that. God just has this simple, single act of awareness by which he is just aware of all.
Yeah. So God, everything is known, not everything is packaged.
Yes.
That's the result. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, hearing this, I imagine many of you hearing this are kind of thinking like, okay, actually that sounds good. That sounds like a good solution to the problem. Well, at least in terms of omniscience, at least you can have omniscience. Everything is known, not everything is packaged, and we're good to go. But there's a remaining problem that comes up when we think about our own descriptions of God's knowledge. And when I think about this, the root of the problem is it's the self-pointing. So I'm going to unpack this a bit, but if God sees everything, okay, then if everything includes God's own seeing, then God's seeing turns in on itself. And so God sees itself. And that leads to that kind of rigid, direct self-reference. And I actually think, I've come to think that kind of circularity is problematic. It really is like self-causation or something explaining itself, making itself come to be. Like, I think there's a priority between the referring thing, the pointing thing, and the thing pointed to in the rigid direct case. Okay, not in the non-direct case where you have a description that then the thing could also fulfill that description, but in that sort of rigid pointing where this sentence is false. This is what leads to a whole host of liar paradoxes. Mm-hmm. And it really is, I think, this sort of rigid self-reference. And so if you have God's awareness, not just of all first order facts of reality, but it's also turned in on that very awareness, then you have that self-reference, that rigid self-reference. And it still leads to a paradox that we can express not in the form that I have on the screen here. You can take the screen off now if you want, just so they can see us. Thank you. we can put it into the paradox in terms of our own description. So I was thinking again about this morning. So let's say that God is aware of everything in a single, simple, undifferentiated act of awareness. That seems fine. I mean, I'm okay with that. It's just that if that implies awareness of his own awareness, then we can actually describe self-referring aspects of God's awareness in our own language and non-self-referring aspects of God's awareness. So we can say, for example, we can say, we can put on a piece of paper a sentence, God is aware of all. That sentence is self-referencing because it includes God's awareness of his own awareness and God's awareness of that own sentence. Mm-hmm. But then you can also think of non-self-referencing things. Like you can have God is aware of the chickens. We describe that in our language. So that's our description. That's our package. And that's not a self-referencing package. But the problem is that as long as there's the reality of God's being aware of all, including God's own awareness, then in our own descriptions, we can come up with self-referencing packages that generate the paradox. And that's why ultimately I don't think that the pure simple awareness solves the problem, because you can re-describe the problem in terms of our own descriptions of the self-reference.
Yeah. And so I think that's an excellent point. I mean, this goes back to the fact that, like, even those who accept, for instance, divine simplicity. Now, we should note that someone can accept this simple view of God's mind without accepting divine simplicity, right? They could even say, yeah, God has a single act of awareness by which he knows things. But they don't need to go on to say that, hey, omniscience is numerically identical to omnipotence, which is numerically identical to necessary existence, and so on. That's not an implication thereof.
It's not required,
So you could take, just for the audience, you could take a simple view of God's awareness or God's knowledge without taking an absolute simple view of God. That's a side thing. But what I wanted to say is that your point there, that the problem just re-arises on the level of our descriptions, right? That's something that's, like, I think, acknowledged by people who, or I should say, ought to be acknowledged for the sake of consistency by people who accept divine simplicity, because what they do is they say, yes, we make various different truthful predications of God, right? So on the side of our language, right, we can truthfully describe God as omniscient. And what we mean by that, what we're saying in our language, is not the same thing as when we're saying that God is omnipotent and that God is ase and so on. But the referent, right, that thing in reality that we are picking out is just the absolutely simple God, right? We're not picking out some property of omniscience, which is numerically distinct from some property or aspect or characteristic of omnipotence, say. So I think they themselves grant that we make these various truthful predications on the side of our language of God. And that need not correspond to numerically distinct things within God in order for those predications to be true, right? And so you are here making these truthful predications about God's awareness, and because they're true, like, that is what's generating the problem. Not the fact that it corresponds to these distinct packages within God's mind. It's the fact that we have the true predications, and so on. That's what's undergirding the problem. So I really don't think ultimately that appealing to this kind of simple view is going to get around the problem. And one last thing before I turn it over to you, the audience, Josh describes in further detail for a general audience why he rejects this as a solution to the particular problem in the resource that we've been talking about, his paper.
That's it. In this article. And let me just say, I mean, it's not like 100% clear to me that this solution couldn't still be developed or still work. It's just, it doesn't automatically solve the problem. You still have the problem of self-reference even in our language. I mean, maybe this shows a problem with, like, our reasoning. Maybe there's a bug, like, in our thinking. But and maybe there's other ways of cleaning out that bug. And so I do want to kind of leave that as an open project for people to sort of think about. But there's another solution that it seems to make more sense to my mind currently, which is that the bug is in the rigid, direct self-referencing. And if we can just remove that, then we remove a host of paradoxes, both in terms of our own descriptions, as well as various liar paradoxes, as well as the paradox that smashes a certain form of Platonism, as well as the paradox that smashes the sort of packaged view of God's mind. We can remove all those paradoxes by removing this sort of rigid self-reference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned, I kind of want to explore this just ever so slightly further. This, you said, it almost brings with it a kind of circularity, like a vicious circularity, this kind of direct self-reference. I almost want to explore that further. So is the idea basically like, let's just focus on an act of knowledge, or maybe just an act of awareness. It seems as though for an act of awareness or an act of knowledge, to be an act of awareness or knowledge of X, for some X, I don't know, there seems to be a directionality of explanation there, like at least in the case of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Knowledge of P, let's say, depends on its being the case that P. It's not as though P, because someone knows that P, rather someone knows that P, anyone knows that P because P. There's a kind of directionality of explanation there. P is prior in the order of explanation to the knowledge of P. Similarly, it would seem as though P is prior in the order of explanation to the awareness of P. But if that's the case, well then this kind of direct self-referential awareness or knowledge wouldn't seem to make too much sense, because then we would have one and the same thing being explanatorily prior to itself.
That's it.
So is that really what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's helpful I actually have at the end of my notes there a kind of hierarchical view of reality, where you have an order of like kind of more basic things explaining less basic things. And I mean, this is the kind of solution to the set paradox. It's like you don't automatically just like have everything packaged in a set. There's a way of saying there are some fundamental elements that aren't themselves sets, and they provide the sort of ground for then sets of those elements. And I will just say that my favorite current view of set theory, other than this sort of plural reference view where you can just, I guess, in a way, translate set thought into plural terms, is to think of sets as contingent packages organized by mental activity. So it's not that the sets automatically exist, it's that a mind can think about first order reality conjunctively or collectively, and that sort of, in a sense, packages that first order reality. And then I want to say something similar with respect to thoughts, that thoughts in a way are packaging organizations of first order reality. So there's the thought that the cat is on a mat, the thought that the mat is on a cat. Okay, those have the same sort of elements, but they're organized differently. And so thoughts are like organizations, conceptual organizations of more basic realities. Like as what you're saying, it's like the cat is prior to my thought of the cat. The cat is prior to my knowledge of the cat. And so if that's right, then you can't have an act of knowledge that is of its own self, because that would make the knowledge prior to itself. And that seems to be problematic. Yeah.
Okay, so so that I just want to at least briefly cover that kind of vicious circularity problem, just because I found it interesting.
Well, it's interesting. It also maybe helps to motivate my solution, because, I think I was less worried about self-reference until I saw these contradictions. It's sort of like you've been thinking about infinity paradoxes. It's like, well, infinity is weird. It might be counterintuitive, but it's just weird. So that's fine. But then once you start to see, oh wait, actually, maybe there's contradictions you can deduce, things that are, you increase the weirdness, basically. Then you start wondering, maybe some kinds of infinity are okay, some are not. Maybe some kinds of self-reference are okay, some are not. If you can tease out tighter degrees of weirdness or like flat contradictions, then that makes it more problematic.
Well, that probably is a nice bridge to your view.
Yes.
Now, so let's talk about your view and how it avoids the problem. And then also, if we have, which I'm sure we probably will, if we have some time after that, we might just look at some other potential solutions that you've come across and why you don't find them convincing. But what is your solution? And anyway, like why? Motivate it for us.
So this is my current working model. And by the way, just in worldview development, I find it helpful to always kind of have a sort of working hypothesis. Sometimes the working hypothesis rises to the level of being like something that I believe to be true, or maybe even that I'm certain of true. And sometimes it's just kind of my best working hypothesis. And I find that actually very helpful, because it helps me to sort of organize my thinking when I'm exploring potential problems, it's like I'm more interested because I'm thinking, okay, how does this fit with my current working model? So my current working model is similar to my favorite view current working model of sets, where sets are contingent, or at least explanatorily dependent, um, but they're based on mental activities of thinking collectively of things. And so I'm thinking something similar, that items of knowledge are contingent or at least dependent activities of thinking in a sort of organized way about reality, or maybe just seeing reality. And so what this means is that if reality has a kind of fundamental mind, let's just assume, so there's a fundamental mind, and this is, let's say, even a maximally awesome mind or a great mind, a perfect mind. But then the question is like, well, what does that imply? Does it imply contradictions? Well, we can avoid this sort of paradox of propositions if we say that the maximal mind has maximal powers to sort of see everything that it draws its attention to, but it's not thereby like forced to see everything. It actually has a certain kind of liberty, a power to not automatically see its own seeing right when it sees. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's not by its nature. It is not the case that by its nature, it automatically and necessarily, we might say purely actually, sees everything, as it were. It's
maybe
not automatic.
First order reality. Yeah. But it doesn't have to sort of thereby see its own seeing, that sort of circularity thing. Mm-hmm. It can reflect, because see, I've wondered if, maybe in the first sort of like ontological moment of reality, fundamental reality just is. And then sort of in the next ontological moment, if I can use this language, it is like aware that it is, it's like I am, like it's aware that I am. And then that provides a kind of bedrock for additional acts of awareness and activity that's possible. And so then that would get out of the puzzle, because it accepts again the conclusion that things aren't automatically packaged. And it explains how that can fit in terms of a supreme mind by, in a way, allowing the mind to also have the power to not like have to see things, if that even makes sense. It adds a power to the mind.
Yeah. So it has the potential to be able to do so, but it's not automatically actual, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have the potential to see all, because to see all implies seeing its own seeing in that very moment of seeing. But it always has the potential to see that which already is, if that makes sense. Yeah. So whatever already is, it can see that. But see, here, what happens is the very act of seeing introduces a new bit of reality, namely that seeing. So what it's doing is it's seeing the original reality, and then its act of doing that brings in a new reality, and then it can see that new reality ad infinitum. And this leads to a kind of like perpetual expanding view of reality. Reality can continue to sort of expand through these acts of reflection. But I mean, because some people might be worried that, well, does that sort of deplete this mind of a great mind, because it doesn't just see all that's there? It's like, well, it does. You could say it does see all that's there apart from its own seeing, and then it can see its own seeing, right? So,
and it has liberty to do so, right? It can choose and so on.
Yeah.
Okay, so now so this has been a long time since I read it, but this the paper that you sent me that I'm linking first in the resources. Don't you contrast the kind of dynamic model with what did you call it? A static model? Is that what you called it?
You could call it that. So I'm calling my model the dynamic model of God's mind, because God's mind can update and see it seeing and see it seeing and seeing. So we could contrast that with the static model that, and it's not static in time or dynamic in time. We can leave that open, actually. Lots could happen in a moment, and happen is just a word, right? I want to leave as much open as possible. I mean, I guess if I put my cards on the table, my current working model is that it would take place in time, because I think time sort of flows out of activities. And so there is an activity of seeing, so that does result in time. But that's not essential to the model itself. That's just based on my theories of time. So
I would agree with
so
you. If
yeah,
I were a theist, I would definitely
yeah,
agree with you. So
yeah,
anyway.
yeah, yeah. So we can contrast that with the kind of static model where all the knowledge that's possible is already actual, and there could be no addition um, to that. And let me just say, just kind of an aesthetic level, there's something to me that seems kind of pleasing about the idea that a fundamental mind can have a kind of dynamic connection with what's going on in the world, so that it can actually experience some of the things that we can experience, maybe in a different way, but it's not like, in a sense, forced to already just see
Yeah.
all, including its seeing of all and all
There's
that
no
stuff.
adventure.
There's no adventure. Yes. So that's kind of just an aesthetic consideration.
Yeah.
At the end, if logic leads you to a result, that then you can maybe celebrate other interesting bonus treasures or aesthetic benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but what's really interesting about this, and again, like for my audience, we're not using this as a weapon to attack other models of God, or we're just exploring and we're trying to think about the fundamental nature of reality and what reason can reveal about it, really. And so, like, we're not trying to bash views on which we have this kind of static model of God, or God might be, let's say, timeless, static, strongly immutable, purely actual, doesn't even have this potential that Josh has been describing. We're not trying to bash those views, but what's interesting is to draw out the connections between these Russellian paradoxes and such views. It's a kind of heretofore underappreciated, we might say, potential problem that afflicts such views. And again, it's a problem that we're using to explore and probe rather than knock down or say that we have some in Super Bowl discovery or whatever.
Yeah.
But okay, so
can I kind of build on that? And I love that spirit, especially because I think there's just a lot more here that one can explore. One thing that I've been thinking about recently is maybe a way of possibly harmonizing some of the divine simplicity instincts, even in my own thinking, with the sort of dynamic aspect of God. Vocabulary is tricky. And I think sometimes people come to a worldview through a set of concepts and through a set of language, so that other views seem very different, maybe scary. But then actually there's interesting ways of kind of recharacterizing things so that things can go together in surprising ways. So I've been thinking about this, like, maybe fundamental reality has a kind of fundamental nature, and this fundamental nature is itself purely actual. It doesn't include potentialities. It's itself static, doesn't change, couldn't be otherwise. But then that allows that fundamental reality could also have be a ground for non-fundamental activities
or
that are
aspects.
still, or aspects and activities, that are anchored into it. And I say anchored deliberately to allow different ways of analyzing that, because the word anchors is a metaphor. It's sort of imprecise, and I use that deliberately because it could be that there's a kind of simplicity. I think this is kind of the view that I've been coming to. It's like that the fundamental nature of fundamental reality, or just like the fundamental reality itself, which maybe grounds its fundamental nature, I don't know, it's not sort of divisible or anything like that, but it's a ground for divisibilities. It's a ground for packages, it's a ground for aspects and activities, including the activity of self-reflection, the activity of building more things. And maybe there's a weird way in which, like, from one conceptual angle, you could think of these things that are grounded as like part of creation. So you might say, well, everything that's part of creation is contingent, limited, and different from God. God's not part of creation. But see, this is where it's like, if you think that the foundational nature of the foundational reality can ground aspects of that reality, there's a way in which even those aspects are characterizing that reality. So you are actually describing God. You are saying God is changing, even if the changing aspects of God are part of creation. Are you following? So I feel like there's ways of describing this where it's like, a view can feel like, oh, you don't want to say that if you believe this, but actually maybe you can say that even if you do believe this, as long as you understand that what you're saying here really is actually consistent with this core idea that the sort of
or
base
the
reality.
core motivations behind it. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's something that I often, I don't know, that I see so much come up in the debates between the kind of, high octane classical theistic views and the more non-classical views like neoclassical theism, open theism, panentheism, and so on. Like the classical theists, oftentimes, they have various motivations that we don't want to paint with super broad brushstrokes, but like oftentimes what they have worries are about like God's aseity, right? God's independence, like his ultimacy, his being the most fundamental thing. That's what motivates their view. But what non-classical theists, what I've seen, at least a lot of non-classical theists do, is like, hey, well, we can preserve that motivation without going the kind of full-blown high-octane route. We just have to have maybe perhaps what you're describing, like we have this divine priority where God is the single fundamental thing and God grounds his own various aspects, say, so it's God isn't dependent on his properties, or God doesn't have these parts that are separable or whatever. He doesn't have properties that kind of build him up or make him up as like molecules make me up or something. There's a kind of hold apart grounding there where God is the most fundamental reality, just this one thing, God, from which everything else flows. And some of the things that God causes might be just contingent acts of his own creation, but other ones might just be things that God himself grounds, and it's his own aspects, his own omniscience, his own omnipotence, and so on. So like, that seems to preserve God's ultimacy. That seems to preserve God's unique status as the only fundamental thing, and so on. So it's like you're preserving these motivations while at least not necessarily going along the route of identifying all these things and saying that they're all just one and the same thing in reality. Again, like anyway, I just want to just emphasize those people. I mean, for those people, some people are on the fence between classical theism and non-classical theism, and they might have these worries, right? How could God be ultimate under non-classical models of God? How could God be ase? How could he be independent? And so on. But like, I'm just saying this so it can inspire them to at least consider non-classical theistic views that arguably preserve such motivations. Now, of course, you can go back and forth on that and so on, but I just want to make that connection to that models of God debate because, we're coming around to probably nearing the end of our discussion. I want to show how this omniscience paradox can just shed light on our models of God, because that's one of the debates that I'm super interested in, just models of God. How should we conceive of ultimate reality if God exists? So, anyway, just wanted to get that.
I love that. Yeah. And I was even thinking, if you can appreciate the core root motivations for a view and show how maybe another view keeps track of those motivations, maybe even illuminates them. There's this weird vocabulary thing that happens where you might even wonder if this other view, because sometimes when I talk with people who describe a certain view, a certain kind of divine simplicity, it feels like there's a kind of wiggle room in how to even interpret it. And so you could almost think of it like, here's one way you could even interpret divine simplicity, right? So what it means to say these things are like identical is to say, and then you spell it out maybe in terms of grounding. You say, well, that's not identity. Well, but maybe that's really getting to what like the spirit was like behind
the motivations, the reasons for which they posited such identifications.
And that's a kind of progress. And I feel like that for me is kind of like a big take home of thinking about this paradox, is that I think the paradox provides like a geyser in the foundation of reality. And that geyser, out of that geyser is like wisdom. And the wisdom is an opportunity to make progress in your own personal sort of thinking about the nature of reality. And so that's what I love about this. I think it can help people to see more than they've seen before for themselves.
And exactly. And what's interesting is like, this sort of dialectic, as it were, comes up in other domains. Like I know in your book with Felipe, it's like the motivations behind Felipe's view and your view. It's like you're kind of showing how you can almost accommodate those. And like you've done this with Graham Oppy as well. It's like, Oppy's adamant on, of course, his central, the way that he goes about arguing for his, let's say, naturalistic view is by first establishing at least an explanatory parity between theism and his naturalism. This is basically just the project. This is a 60-second elevator pitch of his book, The Best Argument Against God, right?
Yeah.
You're establishing at least an explanatory parity with theism, but then going on to say that it's simpler. And so we should prefer that over theism. Now, what I've seen you do in your conversations with him, that I've had with you on Micah's channel and so on, and just our email exchanges over the years, it's like you are trying to accommodate his kind of view of simplicity and showing, or at least arguing, that you can sort of bring that into a theistic worldview.
Even naturalism, even his concept of the natural reality.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, I like making connections between these different domains. And this is one of those connections where it's like the dialectic that we've pursued here also comes up in all sorts of other domains.
Well, it's so helpful for worldview building in general. I mean, I find that if I have a deep disagreement on a topic of the nature of reality, it's almost like there's like three things that are going to happen. Like either I'm going to discover like that I was wrong, right? I guess maybe in the same category, they're going to discover they're wrong. So we resolve the disagreement. Or I'm going to find some way of synthesizing the views so I can see how they can maybe go together. Okay, I guess those are the three. Either I'm wrong, they're wrong, or there's some way of synthesizing. So I feel like I have this almost like this attitude that, well, if I can't convince you, then I have to just assume that I'm wrong. Like I just have to, because if I wasn't able to convince you, there's got to be some reason for that. But if I actually, at the end of the day, still don't think that I'm wrong, then okay, there's got to be a way of synthesizing these. So that's kind of how I like think about it. And it's led to a lot of interesting developments in my own thinking.
Yeah, and it builds bridges between people, which is also something that we love to do here at the Majesty of Reason, of course. Yeah. So before ending, maybe we could just cover one or two, maybe one other response to the Omniscience Paradoxes. We covered the one that you mainly wanted to cover, which was the divisibility response. And then we got your own kind of solution to it that shows how that avoids the paradox, whereas the kind of static view arguably would face it. What's some other way that
I don't have too much else here prepared, except to say, I mean, there were the sort of responses to the Platonist version. We kind of skated through those briefly, but another response in general that you could have is just to live with a mystery. I mean, I like to have a working hypothesis that helps me organize a lot of ideas, but there is a kind of intellectual strength and a maturity to just, say, I just don't know, but this is hard to understand,
that's the life of an agnostic.
Yes,
oh my goodness, it is so hard.
It's hard too, because like people might think, oh, you don't know because you haven't thought about it. It's like, no, like you really thought about it, but you've actually withstood the temptations to simplify and come to a view. You're actually, because there is a temptation, because it sort of in a sense resolves it for you. But I think sometimes if you see that geyser and it's just like flowing out, you're like, what is that? Like, what? You could try to block the geyser, put a big rock on it, or you could just like run away. Like that's too scary. Or you could just like kind of sit next to it and just like watch it for a while, see what comes out, And I don't know, maybe we could even end on that as an invitation for people thinking about this, is to, kind of let the geyser flow and just think about it. Like let the puzzle turn in your mind. And sometimes what happens is, if you're looking for a solution too quickly, you'll find a solution to one way of articulating or interpreting the paradox, and then you're satisfied, but you don't look back to see, wait, is there actually another way of interpreting it, so that even my solution, like the simple awareness solution, right? Is there another way of interpreting it so that it actually still comes back, like in terms of our descriptions or whatever? And I think that's where you get a lot more wisdom, is that you do try to come up with solutions, but then you also go back to the problems. Is there a way of still, does the problem go deeper than my solution? Is there a way of interpreting it in another way? It's like this a lot of times in the dialectic.
It's just like,
please go. Yeah.
Sorry, I just got so excited because it's like, that's exactly what happens in the modal ontological argument debate, right? Someone gives a symmetry breaker. They're like, I've broken symmetry. But then they don't go back to like, oh, hold on a second.
They as in us?
Yeah, exactly.
You're talking about us?
A person doesn't go back.
A person.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we've experienced this.
Yes, exactly. A person doesn't go back and like, oh crap, like I just used a principle, but like you could just add in a negation to my principle, and then you justify the reverse modal ontological argument. So it's like you don't do those slight modifications to the original paradox and see that they apply to your very own view. Similarly, for lots of proposed symmetry breakers that people have leveled, the symmetry just re-arises in a different guise, as it were. And so it's so important once you give a solution, not to just be like, I've got a solution, I'm done. Like, no, try to test your solutions, right? This is what scientists do. They test things, they try to refute them. So test your solution, try to modify the original problem and see if your view actually, or your solution actually still faces it, right? It might just come up in a different guise. You might just have to add a different, like a negation here or there, or you might just have to get a different symmetrical principle and so on. So like, always be retesting something like your proposed solution to see if you can modify the original problem to show that ultimately you didn't get a solution. And
well, I think that, that's where virtue comes in. I think the intellectual virtues, because it takes a certain kind of virtue to withstand the pain of uncertainty, because sometimes like an argument can create certainty, or a rebuttal to an argument can create certainty that, that argument fails, it's been rebutted, right? But it takes certain kind of intellectual virtue to withstand the pain of uncertainty, to just go back to the argument. Like, is there another way of looking at this? Or go back to the rebuttal. Is there another way of looking at this? And that's where I think I understand, we're talking about these puzzles, but there's a way in which the intellectual virtues, I think, your response to the puzzles is going to guide how much wisdom you get out of the puzzles. I think that seems to me like the most important thing.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. This probably, we're wrapping up here, maybe 5 more minutes or something. But like for me, that kind of certainty, I don't know. Like, so there's this argument in philosophy of science, and it's called the unconceived alternatives argument. And it's an argument for anti-realism. I don't think the argument succeeds. I'm a realist, but it's interesting because the argument is basically like, I mean, hey, in the past, for all these past failed theories, what's the reason that they failed? Well, like one of the reasons that they failed is that the scientists who, the scientific communities who accepted them and who proposed them and so on, there was just lots of previously unconceived alternative theories that better explained the data, that were more empirically adequate, that were simpler and so on. Also, there were previously unconceived pieces of evidence, previously unconceived techniques, previously unconceived observations, previously unconceived and so on, experimental methods. And so like, what you're doing is like, well, given that that's been happening in the past, like what makes us think that our current theories aren't going to be facing these unconceived alternative theories that are even better, and that there are unconceived better evidence and so on. And like, ultimately, like, I'm not convinced of that argument, but like the core there, I think, is an invitation almost to epistemic humility. And that's, I don't know, I just find that recurring in my own mind. It's like, let's say I come up with a new argument for some thesis, or a purportedly new argument, whatever. I come up for a new argument for some thesis. I mean, just because I haven't seen an objection to it, or maybe it seems clearly true or obvious to my mind, I'm still going to like have a knockdown in credence, because I know in my own past that for so many things that I previously thought were clear or obvious or true or so on, I just hadn't conceived of or hadn't even been exposed to a good criticism of that. And upon receiving that previously unconceived criticism or response, I changed my mind, right? So it's like for the audience, like, you might come across a particular argument, let's say an argument for God, or an argument against God, or a particular response to an argument. And you might just think like, hey, that's knocked down. It's the end of the conversation. It's done. I mean, that's proof. I mean, just think like, surely so many times in your own past, you thought that something was true or thought that something was obvious, and you just hadn't conceived of or hadn't been exposed to good criticisms of it. And so for me, like, there's always that looming possibility. And so that's something that just perpetually knocks down my credence, at least somewhat, in lots of things that I accept or find true.
Joe, I love that. I was smiling because you used the word surely. And then it's funny because anytime you read a philosophy article and it uses the word surely, I find there's a high % chance that what comes next is like probably not so sure.
Exactly.
Actually. So there's even this weird way in which even that epistemic humility, like it sort of turns on itself. It's like the self-reference, like you can be humble about being humble too, right? Because like sometimes you can be sure, like even you said, surely, right? And so that's kind of interesting too. And maybe that's a good note to end on, because it sort of shows the pointing back on itself.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
We
Full
must
circle.
be humble.
Yes, exactly. Literally gone
Yeah.
full circle. Yeah. And of course, another aspect of intellectual humility is not always, as bunch of authors in the virtue ethics literature point out, like, it's for the audience. I'm saying, obviously, I'm not trying to, teach you or anything, but
You're not trying to teach your audience is very intelligent.
yeah,
So
that's true. I'm trying to facilitate insight flow. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to the virtue ethics literature. Like, epistemic humility isn't just a matter of, oh man, I'm not that, I'm not that smart. Oh man, I might be wrong. I always might, it's not always that kind of negative thing. Rather, it's an appropriate assessment of your own status, your own evidential base, the evidential base behind the views that you hold, the evidence and considerations that you're aware of and that you've looked into, and the books and so on that you haven't. It's an appropriate attitude towards all these sorts of things. In some cases, the appropriate attitude to take might be certainty, right? So like, you might be certain that you exist. That might actually be an appropriate attitude to take. And so epistemic humility isn't always in contradistinction to certainty. I just want to put that on the audience's radar. It's more about the appropriate response to your evidential situation, your position on the epistemological landscape that we talked about in our video on how to discuss the nature of reality.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're probably going to end it there. That was such a fun conversation, Josh.
I love
always love having you on. And do you have any final words before I turn this off or whatever?
Maybe just one kind of final thought is just on that sort of first person epistemology, where you're sort of looking at things kind of by your own best light. And, you might not be sure like how other people are thinking about this. And maybe that own unsureness in your own awareness invites humility. But as you think about it, there might be some things that just strike you as right and some things that strike you as wrong. And I think for me, I find that if you just kind of follow your own light, it leads you to see more and more and more, especially if you start to see things for yourself or see that you don't see things and you're seeing that you're not seeing it. That's something that you're seeing, and then that's helpful and that takes you deeper in. And so just to come back to that sort of metaphor of the geyser of wisdom, I feel like this paradox of self-reference, you can apply it as a probe to thinking about God's mind. But it's also, for me, it's been a probe for thinking about the mathematical landscape and the question of Platonism and just the question of the nature of reality. And so I think that that's kind of where I'd want to end it, is just sort of think about the self-reference as a probe for investigating more about reality.
All right, so you can stay around for a little bit after I click stop recording. So this is just my little outro. Everyone, if you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button or do all that YouTube stuff that you guys could do. Maybe leave a heart as a comment, or, hearts for Josh or something, or maybe multiple exclamation points, maybe like 30, I don't know. Anyway, if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'm a lowly college student, and so you guys are unironically helping me pay my student debt and get through college, and in turn, use that college education and my research and so on to, produce videos like this for you guys. So if you see value in the work that I do, if you like this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon or a one-time donation. I think that's on PayPal. I think that's linked in there. And what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.